When the cold of winter threatened to swallow everything in its path, one man dared to think differently. Neighbors laughed at his decision to build a Quonset hut inside an old barn. But what they didn't know was that this unconventional structure would become the fortress that kept him safe when the world outside was frozen solid. In a harsh world where survival was the only currency, he had found a way to not only endure the storm, but thrive in it. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're fascinated by survival stories and inventive solutions like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode brings even more unbelievable tales from the frontier, so you won't want to miss it. The town of Summit Ridge had seen its share of bitter winters, but this one was different. The cold came early, and it came with a vengeance. By mid-November, the frost had already claimed the trees, the air sharp and biting, like 1,000 tiny needles piercing through the skin. The small mountain community was used to hardship, but this year felt like something darker was brewing. Inside a weathered barn on the outskirts of town, Jonathan Miller was already at work. The barn, once a place for livestock and hay, now served as a refuge for him. It had been months since he'd decided to build the Quonset hut, and the structure was beginning to take shape. The neighbors didn't understand. They laughed when they saw him hauling in metal and insulation, scoffing at his plans to build something so unconventional. But Jonathan had long since stopped listening to the murmurs of others. He knew the storm was coming, and he had no intention of facing it unprepared. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, slamming against the barn's old wood. Snowflakes swirled through the air, carried by gusts that made it feel as though the mountains themselves were trying to bury everything beneath their weight. But inside, Jonathan was warm. The glow of the lantern on the workbench illuminated his hands as he worked. Every piece of the Quonset hut had to be perfect. It was his last hope, his last chance to stay ahead of the bitter winter. The barn had its own warmth, a sort of comfort that came with years of history. But the hut was something different. It was a fortress, a symbol of his defiance against the weather, the world, and those who had laughed at him. Each curve of the metal sheeting, each layer of insulation that he meticulously placed, was a testament to his stubbornness and his belief in his own vision. As he worked, Jonathan couldn't help but think about the neighbors. They'd never truly understood his need to be prepared. They thought his ways were too old-fashioned, too extreme. They couldn't see the dangers he saw in the mountain's icy grip. To them, this was just another harsh winter. But Jonathan knew better. He had lived through enough to know that the cold wasn't something to take lightly, not this time. His hands shook as he tightened the final bolt on the hut's framework. For the first time in days, he stood back and surveyed his work. The Quonset hut was not yet complete, but the foundation was solid, and, more importantly, it was warm enough to survive whatever this winter had to throw at him. Jonathan awoke early the next morning to the sound of snow settling on the barn's roof. The world outside was quiet, too quiet, like nature was holding its breath. He pulled on his thick woolen socks and laced up his boots, the weight of the task ahead settling in his chest. The Quonset hut still needed work, but it was close enough that he could finally rest a little easier. For now, it stood as his best chance, his personal shelter against the elements. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the barn's walls, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Jonathan's breath clouded in the cold air as he moved toward the door, pulling on his thick coat. He stepped outside, the crisp air biting at his exposed skin. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked to the edge of the property, taking in the vast expanse of white. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks crowned with fresh snow, a reminder of the power and danger that lay just beyond his reach. A gust of wind swept through, howling across the open expanse, and Jonathan pulled his collar up tighter around his neck. It was then that he realized just how much he'd come to rely on the warmth that the Quonset hut would bring. There was no turning back now. Back in the barn, the cold was already creeping in. The wood beams that supported the barn groaned in protest as the temperature plummeted even further. But Jonathan's focus was unwavering. He'd spent the last few months planning, building, and refining his hut. It was more than just a shelter, it was a lifeline. The Quonset hut, with its rounded metal frame and insulation, was designed to trap heat efficiently, even in the coldest of winters. Jonathan had spent hours researching, adjusting the design to suit his needs. Every inch of the hut had to be perfect. It had to be airtight, watertight, and above all, warm. By noon, the snow had started falling again, the sky a dull gray, heavy with the promise of more. Jonathan knew the storm was coming fast. The wind was picking up, and soon the temperature would plummet even further. The storm would test everything he had built. It would test the hut, his preparation, and his resolve. He didn't know how long he could hold out if the hut didn't work. With a sense of finality, he began the last stretch of his work. Each task, from securing the final panels to ensuring the smoke vent would function properly, was done with careful precision. The wind outside raged, but Jonathan stood still, inside his own quiet space, knowing that he had done everything he could to survive the coming winter. The storm had come, and now it was time for the Quonset hut to prove its worth. The wind didn't just howl that day, it screamed. It felt as though the mountains themselves had unleashed their fury, and Jonathan was at the mercy of their power. The barn's walls trembled under the weight of the storm, and the snow began to fall heavily, a relentless flurry that blinded the landscape. Jonathan stood by the door of the barn, his eyes scanning the wild whiteout outside. The Quonset hut, nestled within the barn's shelter, was his only protection against what would be one of the harshest storms he had ever faced. Inside, the temperature had begun to drop. He could feel the bite of the cold creeping in through the cracks, and though the barn kept some of it at bay, Jonathan knew the real test had arrived. The hut, still in its infancy, would either stand tall or crumble beneath nature's wrath. He couldn't afford to wait and see. He had prepared for the worst, but doubts gnawed at him like an animal in the dark. Jonathan pulled on his heavy boots and wrapped a scarf tightly around his neck before making his way toward the Quonset hut. The wind outside shrieked like an animal in pain, but inside the barn, a different kind of quiet had taken hold. His lantern flickered as he entered the small insulated space, the only light in a room surrounded by metal. The smell of fresh wood, metal, and insulation lingered in the air. He had worked tirelessly to get this far, but now, with the storm closing in, he needed to know if his creation could withstand nature's cruelty. He touched the walls of the hut, feeling the solidity of the structure, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of the metal. The inside was surprisingly warm, sheltered by the insulation, and it gave him a small sense of relief. The Quonset hut, despite its unusual design, seemed to hold the heat better than any shelter he had ever built or seen. But the storm was still escalating. The roar of the wind grew louder, and Jonathan could hear the barn's creaky walls straining against the pressure. By dusk, the snow had accumulated several feet deep, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. He couldn't ignore the harsh reality any longer. The barn wouldn't be enough to protect him. It was time to move into the hut for good. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan gathered his courage. He knew that once he closed the barn doors behind him and locked the Quonset hut's makeshift door, there would be no turning back. He had spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the complete isolation that awaited inside. The moment the doors closed, he would be cut off from the world, safe only as long as the hut held. The wind outside shrieked, as though trying to tear the very earth apart. But inside the Quonset hut, there was a strange, almost surreal silence. Jonathan stepped carefully over the wooden threshold, his boots crunching on the snow that had drifted in during the last few hours. He moved quickly, closing the door behind him with a sense of finality. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was truly alone. The lantern cast a soft glow against the walls of the hut, making the metal and insulation feel like a cocoon, a shield against the wildness outside. Jonathan placed his coat on a makeshift peg and pulled out a small stove, positioning it in the center of the room. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. This was the beginning of something new. He had left the safety of the barn for this, an uncertain experiment in survival. But the warmth of the stove began to fill the room, and with each breath, Jonathan felt a small measure of relief. The temperature had plummeted outside, but inside the Quonset hut it felt like a different world. The heat from the stove quickly permeated the small space, and the cold was kept at bay by the insulation he'd spent so many weeks installing. The walls of the hut, though simple in design, were holding, and that was more than he could have hoped for on that first night. As Jonathan unpacked the few supplies he had brought in, some canned food, a small sack of potatoes, a bit of dried meat, he allowed himself a moment to sit and reflect. The wind howled outside, but here, in the warmth of his creation, he was safe. The storm's fury seemed to fade as the crackling stove added a comforting soundtrack to his solitude. But that sense of peace was fleeting. He had always been a man who thrived on action, on purpose. Now, with the wind at his back and the shelter surrounding him, Jonathan was left with only his thoughts and the memory of all the work he had put into the Quonset hut. He moved over to a small cot he had set up in the corner, its worn sheets a reminder of the long nights ahead. His body ached from the days of labor, but sleep didn't come easily. There was too much on his mind. The storm outside wasn't just a test of the hut. It was a test of his resolve, his stubbornness, and his belief in his own vision. Would the hut survive the night? Would the cold eventually breach its defenses? As the hours passed, Jonathan drifted in and out of sleep, listening to the howling winds and wondering if the storm would ever stop. But as dawn's light began to break through the small window, he awoke to a surprising stillness. The storm had not relented, but inside the temperature was steady. The Quonset hut had held its ground. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan allowed himself a brief smile. The storm outside may have raged, but inside he was warm, and the hut had passed its first test. By the second morning inside the Quonset hut, Jonathan felt a strange sense of triumph that he hadn't expected. The storm had intensified overnight, but the hut had held its ground. The barn, once his refuge, was now nothing more than a distant memory. The cold outside was unforgiving, but inside he was warm. The stove crackled softly in the corner, and the metal walls of the hut seemed to hum with a quiet resilience. Jonathan stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. The first light of dawn seeped in through the small, reinforced window. Snow clung to the outside, its pure white surface reflecting the pale sunlight that broke through the thick clouds. As he walked over to the window, he could see nothing but a blinding sheet of snow stretching across the land. The storm wasn't going to let up any time soon. The wind had died down slightly, but it still howled at the edges of the Quonset hut. Jonathan could hear the storm pushing against the metal frame, as though trying to tear it apart. But unlike the barn, which had groaned and creaked in protest under the pressure, the hut remained solid. Every inch of the structure had been tested, and it was passing with flying colors. He glanced over at the stove, watching the flickering flames dance within the small cast-iron chamber. The warmth was a comfort, something he hadn't realized he would rely on so heavily. In the barn he had the luxury of space, of a place to hide away when the storm came. But here there was no hiding. This was his last line of defense, and it was proving to be stronger than he had dared hope. The storm outside raged on, and Jonathan felt a wave of gratitude for his hard work. The neighbors, those who had laughed at his decision to build a Quonset hut in a barn, had no idea what he was enduring and succeeding at. They would never understand the effort it had taken to transform that scrap of metal and wood into something capable of withstanding nature's wrath. As the day wore on, Jonathan made his usual rounds inside the hut. He checked the stove, adding more wood to keep the fire going. The hut was holding heat better than he could have hoped for. There were no drafts, no cold spots in the corners. The insulation he had meticulously laid out was doing its job, trapping the warmth and keeping the cold at bay. By noon, the storm was still fierce, but Jonathan knew one thing for certain: he was safe. The hut had passed its first true test, and it had come out victorious. The storm might not be over, but for now, inside this strange, sturdy structure, Jonathan felt secure. For the first time in days, a true sense of peace settled over him. He wasn't just surviving the storm, he was thriving in it. The wind outside continued to howl, but Jonathan felt a quiet pride. He had created something that worked. He had proved the doubters wrong, and in that moment he knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. By the time the storm began to wane on the third day, Jonathan had become accustomed to the rhythm of life inside the Quonset hut. The warmth from the stove, the steady hum of the metal walls against the wind, the simple act of living in such isolation, it had all become his new reality. The world outside, once so important, had faded into the background as he focused on his immediate surroundings. The hut had proven itself, and Jonathan began to believe more than ever that he had made the right choice. But as the snow began to soften outside and the storm finally seemed to lose its grip on the mountains, something unsettling began to creep into his mind. The sense of triumph he had felt just days before began to fray at the edges, replaced by something darker: doubt. It was subtle at first, a lingering thought, an unspoken question that flickered in the back of his mind as he worked. The neighbors, he realized, might never fully accept his creation. They would likely never see it for what it was, a sanctuary in the middle of a storm. It was one thing for him to believe in it, to trust that he had built something that could withstand nature's fury. But what if they were right? What if all the effort he had put into the hut was a waste of time? The storm was over now, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong to believe that the hut alone could provide for him. The doubts were faint, like a shadow just out of reach, but they lingered. Would he be able to live here for the rest of the winter? Would the hut still be enough when the storms grew worse, when the temperature dropped even lower, when the world outside became even more treacherous? He stood by the window again, looking out at the slowly clearing skies. The snow was beginning to settle, leaving behind a thick layer that covered everything in its wake. The trees were bent under the weight of the snow, their branches heavy and broken. The world looked cold, barren, and distant. For the first time since he had built the hut, Jonathan questioned whether this was enough. Could the hut truly protect him from everything that might come? The quiet voice of doubt was growing louder now, seeping into the corners of his thoughts. He turned away from the window and began to pace the small space, his mind racing. There was no turning back now. He had built the hut. He had made the choice to rely on it. But as the storm's fury turned into a gentle snow, Jonathan realized something. His journey had only just begun. The real test wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about finding the strength to believe in himself when the storm was over, when the world returned to its usual quiet. And that, perhaps, was the hardest test of all. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind was deafening. Jonathan had grown used to the howling winds, the roar of nature fighting against the shelter he had built. Now, with the storm gone, there was only silence, a silence that pressed in on him, almost as heavy as the snow outside. The world had become a blank slate, a canvas painted in white. Inside the Quonset hut, the warmth from the stove had begun to dissipate, and the cold crept in once again. But it wasn't just the physical chill that was unsettling. The emotional chill was far worse. The doubts that had quietly lingered in his mind. For the past few days now seemed to grow louder. They came in the form of thoughts he couldn't silence, whispers that questioned the very foundation of what he had built. He had isolated himself here, away from everyone, away from everything he had ever known. The neighbors had laughed at him, mocked his decision to build the Quonset hut in the first place. They would never understand what it had taken to get this far. But now, as he stood in the small insulated space, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was still missing. His work, his effort, had it truly been enough? The silence was like a wall that pressed against him from all sides. The days were long inside the hut, and the nights were even longer. The world outside seemed to have forgotten him, as though nature had erased his existence in its endless march of winter. In this solitude, Jonathan couldn't help but feel like a tiny figure against the vastness of the wilderness, a man lost in a sea of snow. Yet there was something he couldn't deny. The hut had worked. It had kept the worst of the cold at bay. The stove, though small, kept the temperature steady, and the walls, solid, insulated, and designed with precision, had withstood the harshest tests. Despite the doubt in his mind, the hut had been his sanctuary, but the emptiness around him felt more oppressive than the cold ever could. He moved toward the stove, adding another log and watching the flames lick at the wood. The warmth spread through the room, a fleeting comfort against the suffocating silence. There were still days of winter ahead. What if the storms returned? What if the hut couldn't withstand a true test? As Jonathan sat down by the stove, staring at the crackling fire, he reminded himself that this was what he had wanted. He had wanted to carve out a life in the wilderness, to create something that could withstand anything nature threw at him. But now, with the storm gone, he realized the real battle wasn't with the weather, it was with himself. The silence was louder than the winds, and it was in this silence that he would have to confront his deepest fear, that the hut might not be enough to keep him from disappearing into the wilderness, unnoticed and forgotten. Days passed, and Jonathan began to find a rhythm in his solitude. The Quonset hut, once a strange and experimental idea, had become his only source of comfort. The storms might rage outside, but inside, the warmth held steady. Despite the growing silence around him, the hut had proven to be more than just a shelter. It was a refuge, a place where he could gather his thoughts and regain his strength. But the days were long, and the nights even longer. There was no one to talk to, no one to share his thoughts with. The isolation had begun to eat at him. Every time he stepped outside, he was met with the same unrelenting cold. The world was a frozen wasteland, and he was the only one in it. It was on the 7th day after the storm that Jonathan began to notice something different. As he stoked the stove and adjusted the logs, he felt a slight shift in the atmosphere. There was a subtle change in the air, a flicker of warmth that seemed to come from within him rather than the stove. It was a sense of hope, something he hadn't realized he had been missing. For the first time in days, he stepped outside the hut, breathing in the fresh, cold air. The world around him was still blanketed in snow, the mountains looming in the distance, but the sky had cleared, and the sun was starting to break through the clouds. The light was faint but real, a promise that the winter wouldn't last forever. The storm had passed, and the cold, while still biting, was beginning to lose its grip. Jonathan squinted against the sun, feeling a small surge of energy. He had survived the worst of the storm. The hut had held. It had kept him warm, kept him alive. The snow, the wind, the isolation, they no longer felt like threats. They were part of the world he had chosen, part of the life he had built for himself. In that moment, Jonathan realized that the doubt he had been carrying had been a product of the isolation, not the hut. The Quonset structure had given him everything he needed. It was solid, dependable, and capable of keeping him safe. It was his creation, and it had served its purpose. With a deep breath, Jonathan turned back toward the hut, his footsteps crunching in the snow. The future wasn't certain, but he knew one thing for sure. He had a place to call his own, and, no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. The world outside might be cold and unforgiving, but inside the Quonset hut he had found warmth, and with it, a flicker of hope for the days ahead. The days after the storm passed were filled with an uneasy calm. Jonathan found himself adjusting to the quiet solitude of his new life. The Quonset hut had become his world, a shelter that shielded him from the harsh realities of the wilderness. But as the world outside continued to grow colder, the silence inside began to settle into something deeper, more unsettling. He had grown used to the howling winds and the constant pressure of the storm, but now that the weather had settled, Jonathan realized how much he had relied on the storm to fill the silence. With no snow to block his view and no wind to drown out his thoughts, the stillness felt overwhelming. There was no escaping it. Each morning he woke to the same quiet, the same routine. He would stoke the stove, check the insulation, and make sure the small woodpile was well stocked. The Quonset hut was still holding strong. No leaks, no cracks in the walls, no gaps in the insulation. The warmth from the stove remained constant, a small comfort in the middle of an otherwise unchanging landscape. But despite the hut's perfection, Jonathan found himself feeling more restless by the day. The snow was still deep, covering everything in sight. Jonathan's footprints were the only sign of life for miles. He spent the mornings collecting firewood from the surrounding woods, the silence broken only by the crunch of his boots in the snow and the occasional snap of a branch under his weight. The world felt distant, like a dream he couldn't quite grasp. His thoughts began to wander, as they often did when the days felt too long. He thought about the neighbors, about the people he had left behind in Summit Ridge. Had they even noticed his absence? Had they forgotten about him already? In this isolation, it was easy to wonder whether anyone would remember the man who had built a Quonset hut in the middle of nowhere. He paused as he reached the edge of the clearing, looking out over the barren landscape. The mountains were still distant, their peaks obscured by a thick layer of clouds. Everything seemed frozen in time, as though the world had stopped moving while he continued to live in it. There was a strange comfort in the stillness, but it was also suffocating. Jonathan longed for a sign, something to remind him that there was more to life than the quiet routine of survival. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of snow and the cold silence that hung in the air. For the first time since he had arrived at the hut, Jonathan felt the weight of his decision. He had built this place to protect himself, to survive. But now, in the absence of danger, he was beginning to wonder if he had built it to protect himself from something else. The loneliness, the isolation, it was beginning to feel like a cage, and he was the only one inside. The quiet lasted only a few days before the storm returned, but this time it was different. The winds didn't just howl, they screamed, tearing through the air like an angry beast, hungry for something to destroy. Jonathan had spent the morning gathering more firewood, preparing himself for what he knew would be a fierce battle with the elements. The first sign of the storm had come in the form of thick, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, a wall of gray that seemed to swallow the sky. By late afternoon, the snow began to fall again, heavier this time, thicker flakes that swirled in every direction. The winds picked up, and soon the Quonset hut was once again surrounded by a blizzard. Jonathan moved quickly to seal the door, making sure the hut was secure. He had seen this kind of storm before, and he knew what it meant. Hours of relentless snow and wind that would make the outside world feel like a desolate wasteland. Inside, he stoked the fire and settled into a rhythm. The stove was burning hot, and the warmth filled the small space, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was different. He had grown accustomed to the storms over the past few months, but this one felt more threatening, more violent. The winds shook the hut's frame, making the walls groan under the pressure. Snow piled against the metal, pressing in on every side. As the storm intensified, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of unease. The peace he had found in the stillness had been fleeting, and now, in the midst of the storm, the isolation seemed even more suffocating. The world outside had become a dangerous place again. The hut had held strong before, but would it survive this? Would it be enough to keep him safe? He moved to the window, peering out into the blinding white. The storm was so intense that he could barely make out the outline of the trees just a few feet away. The snow seemed to fall in sheets, the wind pushing it sideways as if trying to find a way in. Jonathan's mind raced as he thought about the last time he'd faced a storm like this. The barn had been no match for the fury of nature. Would the Quonset hut fare any better? The wind howled louder, and the snow seemed to press against the walls more urgently. Jonathan felt the familiar tension creeping back into his chest. The hut had held through the first storm, but this one felt different. It felt like it was pushing him to the edge, testing not only the strength of his shelter, but also his resolve. He turned away from the window and walked over to the stove, adding another log. The crackling of the fire seemed louder now, as if in response to the storm's fury outside. Jonathan had built the Quonset hut to withstand the worst, and now as the storm raged on, he could only wait and see if it would hold. The wind outside was relentless, but inside, the hut remained warm and steady. Jonathan let out a slow breath, his grip tightening around the metal handle of the stove. The storm had returned with a vengeance, but he was ready. This was his test. And no matter what happened, he would face it. Alone, but not defeated. The storm raged for days, its fury unrelenting. Jonathan had lost track of time as the winds howled outside, the sound so loud it almost drowned out everything else. The Quonset hut, though sturdy, groaned with the pressure of the elements, but it held firm. Inside, the warmth from the stove kept the cold at bay, but the feeling of isolation grew heavier with each passing hour. Jonathan's thoughts seemed to echo in the silence that had settled over the hut. He spent hours watching the snow pile up outside, the world beyond the small window slowly disappearing beneath the weight of the storm. The once clear outline of the trees, the path leading to the barn, all of it was swallowed by the white landscape. The world had become a blank slate, a place where time seemed to stand still. As the days stretched on, Jonathan found himself thinking back to the moments before the storm. How carefree he had been in the days following the first storm, proud of his work, confident in the security of his shelter. Now he felt like a man fighting an unseen enemy. The storm wasn't just testing the hut, it was testing him. Every gust of wind, every flake of snow felt like a reminder of his vulnerability. He had always known the risks of living in isolation, but this storm brought a new awareness, a sharp edge to his understanding of the wilderness. The quiet confidence he had felt in the calm before the storm now seemed naive. The storm was proving to be a far more formidable adversary than he had anticipated. The hut, despite its strength, wasn't immune to the storm's power. The wind would howl with such intensity that the walls vibrated. At times, the metal seemed to bend under the force, and Jonathan would rush to check the windows, making sure the shutters were secure, the seals intact. The snow piled higher against the hut, blocking the small window that had once offered him a glimpse of the world outside. As the days blurred together, Jonathan began to wonder if he had made a mistake by staying out here, alone. There was a flicker of doubt that crept in with the storm's relentless force. Had he overestimated the durability of the hut? Had he misjudged his ability to withstand such an overwhelming force of nature? But each time the storm battered the walls, the Quonset hut held. And with that realization came a surge of determination. The storm might be powerful, but it was not invincible. Neither was he. The storm would pass, and when it did, he would still be here, inside his creation, weathering the storm with all the strength he had. By the 5th day of the storm, Jonathan had become accustomed to the rhythm of survival. He woke each morning to the same routine, stoking the fire, checking the insulation, and making sure the small space remained warm enough to survive. The world outside was still blanketed in snow, the storm's fury showing no sign of letting up, but inside the Quonset hut, Jonathan felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the storm that had changed. It was him. The doubt, the uncertainty that had clung to him in the early days of the storm had slowly started to dissolve, replaced by something else. A quiet acceptance. He had been tested, pushed to the brink, and yet he had come through it all. The Quonset hut had withstood the storm's fury, and so had he. Jonathan sat by the stove, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the flickering flames. The fire had become his constant companion, a symbol of warmth and stability in a world that seemed determined to test his every limit. The snow outside continued to fall, but the sound was different now. It wasn't the wild roar of the wind, it was the soft, steady rhythm of a storm slowly coming to an end. For the first time in days, Jonathan felt at peace. He had faced the worst the storm had to offer, and he had come through it stronger. The Quonset hut had been his sanctuary, a place that kept him safe, kept him warm, and kept him alive. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a symbol of his ability to endure, to overcome, and to adapt. In the stillness of the hut, Jonathan felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. He had built this place for survival, but in the process, he had found something more, a deeper understanding of his own resilience. The storm might have taken everything else. The world outside had become a frozen wasteland, but inside the Quonset hut, he was safe. He was whole. He was not just surviving, he was living. He stood up, stretching his legs, and moved to the window. The storm had finally begun to subside, the snowflakes lighter, the wind less fierce. The world outside was still covered in snow, but the air felt different now, crisper, clearer. The worst was over. Jonathan allowed himself a moment to take in the beauty of the quiet landscape. It wasn't the barren, desolate wilderness it had once seemed to be. It was a place of possibility, a world waiting to be shaped. And in that moment, Jonathan realized that the Quonset hut, built with his own hands, wasn't just a structure that kept him safe from the storm. It was a symbol of his ability to create something lasting, something that could withstand whatever the world threw at him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Jonathan knew that the storm had given him more than just survival. It had given him clarity. And with that clarity, he understood that the journey he had begun in building this hut was far from over. He had endured the worst, but he was just beginning to discover what he could truly achieve. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt almost foreign. Jonathan stood by the window, watching as the snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, the last remnants of winter falling away. The world outside had been transformed once again. What had once been a blinding white wasteland now seemed like a blank canvas, a place of possibility. Inside the Quonset hut, the warmth from the stove had finally become a consistent comfort. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a steady heat that was a stark contrast to the cold that had ruled the mountains for so long. Jonathan had spent the past few days checking the perimeter of the hut, ensuring that the insulation was still holding strong, that the structure remained solid. But now, with the storm behind him, he found himself at a crossroads. The winds had calmed, and the snow had started to settle, revealing patches of earth beneath the blanket of white. The landscape outside was still harsh, but it felt different now, more alive, more open. Spring was still a distant thought, but it was beginning to reveal itself, inch by inch. Jonathan felt the subtle pull of change in the air. The silence that had weighed so heavily on him during the storm was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet promise of renewal. As he stepped outside the hut, the air felt fresher, lighter. The harsh winds had given way to a calm, and the snow beneath his boots crunched as he walked. The landscape that had once felt oppressive now seemed like a place he could inhabit, a place that was no longer hostile but instead welcoming him back into its fold. The world felt bigger now, as though the storm had cleared the path for him to move forward. Jonathan moved slowly, taking in the surroundings. The trees that had been bent under the weight of the snow were beginning to straighten, the branches sagging less with the melting snow. The frozen ground, which had been unforgiving just days ago, now seemed to offer a new sense of possibility. He thought about the work that lay ahead, more firewood to gather, more provisions to prepare for the coming months. But there was something different in his thoughts now. For the first time since he had come to this place, Jonathan wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about building something lasting, something beyond the immediate needs of shelter and warmth. He walked further from the hut, surveying the land around him. The earth, though still cold, seemed to be awakening from its winter slumber. There were signs of life, small patches of green beginning to push through the snow, the occasional bird flitting from tree to tree. For all the harshness of the winter, spring was making its way through. As Jonathan returned to the hut, he felt a surge of hope. The storm had tested him, but now, with the storm behind him and spring on the horizon, he felt like a different man. The world outside was still unpredictable, but he had learned to survive it. He had learned that no matter how cold or unforgiving the wilderness might be, there was always a way through. The Quonset hut had kept him safe, and now, with the first signs of spring, he was ready to face whatever the future held. Spring was not the sudden warmth Jonathan had imagined. It arrived slowly, creeping in like a whisper rather than a shout, and the mountains held on to their cold stubbornly. Though the snow had begun to recede, the land was still covered in patches of ice, and the mornings remained frigid. Jonathan stood by the door of the Quonset hut, watching as the sun rose over the jagged peaks, casting a soft light on the world outside. Despite the lingering chill, the landscape was undeniably changing. The air felt fresher, the days longer, and the promise of warmer weather was on the horizon. Yet as Jonathan moved to start his morning routine, tending to the fire, checking the hut's structure, he realized that the change he had hoped for wasn't just about the seasons. The challenge was no longer just about surviving the cold. It was about maintaining his life here, in this isolated place, now that the immediate danger of the storm had passed. The Quonset hut had been his fortress during the storm, but now it felt like a sanctuary under siege in its own way. There were new threats, some obvious, others insidious, that he had never anticipated when he first built it. The harshness of the winter had driven him to focus only on survival, but now that he had a bit of peace, he began to see the cracks in his plans. Jonathan moved toward the small window in the hut and looked out at the land he had come to know so well. The first signs of life were emerging from the snow, the soft green of mosses, the tiny buds on the trees, and the occasional bird darting between branches. Yet for all the beauty of the landscape, there was still an underlying tension. The wildness of the mountains hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone into hiding for the time being. The real challenge, Jonathan realized, was the constant need for maintenance. The Quonset hut had weathered the storm well, but it was not a set-it-and-forget-it solution. As the snow melted, the ground softened, and the structure began to settle. He had built it to withstand the elements, but he had never accounted for the way the seasons would change the land around him. The hut needed to be reinforced, the walls checked for any new gaps caused by shifting soil and settling ground. He spent the morning inspecting the structure, noticing small leaks near the foundation, cracks along the metal walls where the seams had begun to give under the pressure of the thaw. Nothing serious yet, but it was clear that the work wasn't over. The hut had protected him through the storm, but now in the face of spring's subtle thaw, it was clear that survival wasn't just about weathering the storms. It was about the steady work of maintaining a life here, one day at a time. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Jonathan was covered in sweat, his hands sore from the labor. But there was something satisfying about the work, something grounding in the simple tasks that kept him connected to the land. The hut wasn't just a refuge, it was a reminder that survival was an ongoing process, a never-ending cycle of adjustments and upkeep. As he paused for a moment, wiping his brow and looking out over the land, Jonathan realized that his journey was far from over. The storm had been the first test, but now, with spring arriving, he was facing new challenges. And for the first time, he felt prepared for them. The Quonset hut had given him the strength to endure, and now it would help him build something lasting. The days grew longer as spring slowly made its way through the mountains, but the changes weren't just in the weather. For Jonathan, the shift in seasons marked a change in how he viewed his life. The harshness of the winter storm had passed, and now the Quonset hut, which had been built solely for survival, was beginning to take on new meaning. Jonathan had always lived with purpose. Every action he took was in the service of survival. His mind was trained to think in terms of what was necessary, what was vital. But now, as he walked around the clearing outside his hut, he realized that survival was no longer the only goal. He had made it through the worst, and the simple act of staying alive wasn't enough anymore. He had created a sanctuary in the Quonset hut, but the world around him still seemed vast, untamed, and daunting. He had carved out a small space of comfort, but now, as the earth slowly thawed, he could see the endless potential for more. He had been focused on surviving the storms, on weathering the worst that nature could throw at him. But now he was beginning to see what life in the wilderness could be like if he truly embraced it. The snow had melted, revealing patches of earth, and the landscape no longer felt like an enemy. He could see the first signs of green in the grass and the trees, the land shifting slowly back into life. The world outside was no longer a threat. It was a place of opportunity. Jonathan felt a renewed sense of energy. It was time to shift his focus, not just from surviving, but from building a life. Over the past few weeks, he had worked hard to repair and reinforce the hut, checking the foundation, sealing cracks, ensuring that the Quonset structure was as solid as it had been during the storm. But now, as he worked, his mind wandered to what he could do next. He had always lived in the moment, reacting to each challenge as it came. But now, for the first time, he felt like he could plan, like he could create something more sustainable, something bigger than just a place to weather the storms. Jonathan had always relied on his resourcefulness. He had learned how to use what the land provided: wood, stone, clay, and even the smallest scraps of metal he could salvage. But now he thought about ways he could truly integrate into the landscape, ways he could nurture the land and make it work for him rather than simply battling against it. He wanted to build a garden, perhaps, or even try his hand at animal husbandry. There was a possibility to plant crops, to raise food for himself beyond just what he could forage. He knew the work ahead would be grueling. It would take time and patience, but that was something he had in abundance. The land was fertile, and he had the skills to coax life from it, just as he had coaxed life from the Quonset hut in the midst of the storm. This place, once just a shelter, could become more than that. It could become a home, a true home. Jonathan spent the next few weeks planning his new projects. He mapped out areas for a garden, a small vegetable patch, and even thought about constructing a small greenhouse. The thought of planting something and watching it grow gave him a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He wasn't just fighting to stay alive anymore, he was building a life that was independent, self-sustaining, and connected to the land. Spring had settled fully over the mountains now, and Jonathan stood at the edge of his newly marked garden plot, the earth beneath his boots soft and rich with possibility. The Quonset hut still stood strong behind him, its walls a constant reminder of the shelter and safety it had provided through the storm, but now it seemed like only a part of his larger vision. The storm was a distant memory, and as Jonathan worked the soil, he felt the land itself begin to pulse with life. He had spent the last several days preparing the plot, turning the soil, removing rocks, and spreading what little compost he had managed to create over the winter months. The work was hard, but Jonathan found satisfaction in each shovel of dirt, each hand that pushed deeper into the earth. He wasn't just digging, he was building a future where he wouldn't have to fight against the land to survive, but where he could work with it, nurture it, and in return, receive what it could offer. The sun beat down on him as he worked, the warmth on his skin a welcome reminder of the season's change. The winter had been long, and the storm had tested every part of him, his resilience, his creativity, and his endurance. But now, as he planted the first few seeds, Jonathan felt a new kind of strength. It wasn't the kind that came from surviving a storm or battling against the elements. It was the kind that came from creation, from taking what nature offered and shaping it into something better, something lasting. As he knelt by the rows of seeds, he thought about the life he had built here. When he had first arrived in the wilderness, it had been with the singular goal of surviving. The Quonset hut had been the means to that end, a refuge against the elements. But now it was more than that. It had become a symbol of his ability to endure, to adapt, and to create. It was a foundation, a place from which he could now grow something more, something that would last beyond the simple act of survival. The work in the garden wasn't easy, and Jonathan knew that it would take time for the crops to take root, to grow into something tangible. But that didn't discourage him. Each day as he worked, he felt a deeper connection to the land around him. He was no longer just surviving the wilderness. He was becoming part of it. The ground beneath his feet, once cold and barren, was now full of life. It would take time, patience, and constant care, but Jonathan knew that this was the beginning of something new. The storm had passed, and now he had the chance to shape his future, to build something that would outlast the seasons and provide for him in ways that went beyond the shelter of the Quonset hut. As the day began to fade, Jonathan stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow and looking over the plot he had worked. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The Quonset hut stood tall behind him, a silent witness to the journey he had undertaken. And, for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. And this place, this land, this hut, this life, was his. As summer crept quietly across the mountain, the once barren land began to bloom with life. Jonathan's garden, nurtured by his hands and patience, had started to show the first signs of progress. Tiny green shoots pierced through the soil, fragile and delicate yet full of promise. The Quonset hut, now a steadfast companion in the wilderness, seemed to stand proudly amidst the growth around it. It was no longer just a shelter. It was part of the land, part of Jonathan's journey. The work had been hard, the days long, but Jonathan had found something deeper in the toil. The land had begun to offer its rewards, and with each passing day, the distance between himself and the wild world around him seemed to lessen. It was as if the land was accepting him slowly as one of its own. The harshness of winter and the isolation that had once gnawed at him no longer felt as pressing. Jonathan walked the perimeter of the garden, inspecting the crops, a feeling of quiet pride settling in his chest. He had created something from nothing, had turned the barren earth into something that could sustain him. The vegetables were small but growing. The promise of a harvest, however modest, was within his reach. It was a moment he had dreamed of when the first cold wind had howled through the hills, when the only goal had been survival. The mountains that had once felt so distant, so unfriendly, now seemed to embrace him. He was no longer just a visitor here. He belonged. The land had tested him, had pushed him to his limits, but it had also given him the tools he needed to thrive. Jonathan had learned to read the weather, to work with the seasons, to understand the rhythm of the earth. Even the storm that had once seemed so terrifying now felt like a distant memory. The winter had been fierce, but it had given way to something stronger. Spring had come, and with it, a new sense of purpose. Jonathan wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. As he knelt to check on a young plant, Jonathan felt the warmth of the sun on his back and the quiet hum of life all around him. The world had once felt cold and indifferent, but now it felt alive, vibrant, full of possibility. And, for the first time since arriving, he knew that this place, this land, was where he was meant to be. The seasons had turned, and Jonathan stood outside the Quonset hut, watching the sun dip low over the mountains. The air was crisp, a reminder that winter was never too far behind, but the warmth of summer still lingered in the evening breeze. The once barren landscape now felt full of life. His garden had flourished, producing enough to see him through the coming months. The work, the constant effort to survive, had brought him to a place of peace. Jonathan felt a deep sense of contentment as he gazed at the patchwork of vegetables in the garden. The fruits of his labor had paid off. The hut, which had once been a necessity to weather the storm, was now a place of comfort, sheltering him not only from the elements, but also from the isolation that had once seemed unbearable. The land that had tested him had now become a part of him. He no longer viewed it as something to be conquered, something to endure. Instead, it had become a companion, a source of nourishment, not just for the body but for the soul. The Quonset hut had stood the test of time, weathering storms, holding strong through winter's worst. But it was no longer just about the shelter. It was about the life Jonathan had built within and around it. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the trees and sending a chill through the air. Jonathan took a deep breath, his mind filled with a quiet clarity. He was where he needed to be. The journey that had begun with survival had blossomed into something more. It had become a journey of self-reliance, of understanding, of belonging. He wasn't just enduring the wilderness. He was becoming one with it. He had made a home here, not just in the hut, but in the land itself. And as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Jonathan knew that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. With a quiet sense of gratitude, Jonathan turned back toward the Quonset hut, ready for whatever the next season might bring. For now he was content. The wilderness had not only given him shelter, it had given him life.